We are in the midst of a new industrial revolution. A revolution where we're seeing a transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy with wind turbines and solar panels. We're transitioning away from combustion vehicles to electric vehicles. We've got new forms of technology like 5G. That's just to name a few. This new industrial revolution is going to require an unsurpassed amount of raw materials. We're going to require different raw materials than we've had previously. And recycling isn't going to be the golden bullet or the silver bullet. Recycling isn't going to fill the gap for two reasons. It's going to be very important in the future, but at the current rate of demand growth for things like electric vehicles and renewables, we're not going to be able to have the equipment in society to be able to recycle and replace that. The reality is that we're going to need to have mines and new supply chains set up. And we need to make sure that these new mines and new supply chains are designed and managed responsibly to make sure that the benefits of the downstream technology are not offset by the impacts of these mines and new supply chains. So how did I get into this? This is me as a young boy. I was just walking around fields looking for shiny rocks. And my passion for rocks really continued and flourished when I studied geology as an undergraduate degree. I was able to look at rocks under microscopes and do all other fascinating things with rocks. But I wanted to see how rocks can influence society. And that's why after completing my undergraduate, I became a journalist, a mining journalist, where I was able to travel the world and see how mines operated in Kazakhstan, in Russia, see the things that other people don't really consider in our society, where these materials come from. After that, I knew that my passion for sustainability and responsibility of our environment, I needed to look elsewhere, and that's why I decided to come to Cornwall and do a PhD at Camborne School of Mines with an emphasis on designing approaches to make sure we build and develop mines and processing plants at a minimal environmental impact so we can supply the low carbon technologies that we need with responsibly produced raw materials. After that, I was lucky enough to be able to form a company. And now I do this, I go around with companies all around the world to try and help us do this problem-solving challenge of making sure that raw materials for our low-carbon economy are sourced in a responsible way. So technology is moving incredibly fast. I'm sure everybody in this room has had many phones in all their generations, and they may update them every couple of years. Electric vehicles are penetrating the market at an unbelievable pace. In 5 or 10 years, it may be unforeseeable or unseeable to actually purchase a combustion engine vehicle. This puts a real challenge on the mining and the processing and the supply chains for these companies. We need to predict what materials need to be where to support the development of these technologies. And there are real concerns in the industry that there might not be sufficient materials for some of these low carbon transitions. Certain materials like lithium and nickel, there are concerns about whether we're going to have those materials in enough abundance to allow for the proliferation of some of these technologies. Now, this is bad for two reasons. One, if we can't proliferate these technologies, we might have issues with replacing them with, say, high carbon technologies. The other point is, if there's a real competition for these materials, are companies just going to get these materials at any cost, any social and environmental cost? As a society, we need to make sure that this doesn't happen. To put into context the kind of demand growth that we're talking about, by 2040, it's forecast that mineral demand for sustainable development will quadruple. That's an incredible amount. For some of these materials, we're going to have to extract more materials in the next 5 years than we have done in all of history. So this is an incredible challenge that we all need to solve as a society, and not just put it out of sight, out of mind. The question is, where are we going to get these materials from? Even as a child, not all rocks are the same, just like all our elements aren't evenly distributed around the world. We might need to go to far-flung countries to find resources. We might need to go to different places to do the processing. Cornwall itself has an abundance of resources. Cornwall has a strong heritage of mining as well. We can see it in the landscapes. We can see, the amazing buildings. We can see scars in the landscapes with maybe where not the best environmental practice was done. We need to make sure that we can maybe repeat this, extract minerals from Cornwall, do it responsibly, and with good environmental and social performance. As a society, we need to make a decision where we're going to get our materials from, and whether we do this within our boundaries or externally. Either way, we need to make sure that they are done responsibly, and we take accountability for the materials that we produce. When I talked about the low carbon technology and the Industrial Revolution, it could refer to a number of things, but two things that I think are key linchpin ingredients for this Industrial Revolution are batteries and motors. So batteries enable us to store energy if we've got a renewable solar power or wind energy. That's no use if we can't store it, so that's why we need batteries. Equally, if we have battery storage in a car but we don't have an electric motor, we can't move that car. So batteries and motors are two linchpin technologies for this low carbon transition. And some key elements that go into batteries can include things like lithium, cobalt, manganese, nickel, and things that might go into motors, rare earths with exotic names like neodymium or praseodymium. So all sorts of elements. You just have to remember your periodic table from the GCSEs, but some of these elements are really key to the transition to the low carbon economy. And I've said low carbon economy a lot, but why is this important? As you may have heard from the COP26 and the IPCC events that happen every so often, we are on a bit of a precipice as a society. We are in real trouble in terms of what kind of impact we're going to have on our environment. Climate change is real, and the predictions for the future are quite dire. We're trying to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature range, and to do this, you can see that we need to change our behaviour quite significantly. The reality is that we need to adopt a lot of these low carbon technologies, and the reality of that is we need to open up lots of mines and new processing plants and new supply chains. But one thing we need to make sure we do is when we are talking about reducing climate change, that we're not just offsetting impacts from one impact category to another. And what I mean by that is, if we focus too much on climate change, are we ignoring social issues? Are we ignoring other issues relating to biodiversity loss, water use impacts? So I call this impact Jenga, and this is a real challenge. We need to have a holistic view when we're making decisions on this. Now, impact Jenga can also relate to geographical locations. So if traditionally we would have a combustion vehicle. We've got emissions coming out of the exhaust, maybe in a city. Now, that can have effects in different ways. It can have human health impacts. It can cause health issues for people. It can also contribute to climate change, and that's occurring during the use phase of the car when we're driving. Now, electric vehicles, they don't have an exhaust. They don't have exhaust emissions. But the reality is, there are impacts with electric vehicles, but they occur upstream at the mine site, whether that's a mine site in the DRC with artisanal miners, or whether that's a mine in China. But there is an impact, and we should have to capture that. And I go back to the point where I said earlier, this shouldn't be out of sight, out of mind. As consumers of these technologies, we should bear a responsibility for making sure that the supply chains of these technologies are acceptable for us. So then I go on to the question, this is a complex challenge. How do we solve it? How can we even start to get our head around the complexity of it? And this is the approach called life cycle assessment. So life cycle assessment has been around for decades, used in other sectors quite robustly, used in construction quite a lot now, and originally developed by Coca-Cola themselves, not the poster child of life cycle assessment, but still the inventor. So life cycle assessment really takes a holistic view of the impacts, takes into account the impacts of the upstream. So what's the impact of producing the chemicals that's used in processing? What impact do the emissions have upstream? And then we get on to I talked about the supply chain being complex, and it really is complex. I mean, a lot of the time, companies might not know their full supply chain. They're just purchasing a material from supplier A or supplier B. They don't know what mine it's come from. But the coming decade, I think there's going to be real pushes for everybody to understand their supply chain. It should be the responsibility of the manufacturers to understand exactly where they're getting their materials. So we need to see more transparency in the supply chain, more use of life cycle assessment so they understand the impacts of their supply chain. But life cycle assessment can also be used to make decisions, understand the environmental performance of different decisions they're going to make. For example, companies might make big claims about, they're building a solar panel here, so they're a green company. But what is the climate change benefit of putting one solar panel in for their whole company? Life cycle assessment can really quantify what the benefit is and whether they're making good decisions or not. So you saw that supply chain, it's complex. To put that in a little bit more context, you can see different parts of the battery supply chain here. So you can see on the left, this is a bird's eye view of a lithium brine operation. So the scale of that is enormous. So that's several football fields across in terms of size. You can then see a processing plant in Russia, which is part of the supply chain for nickel, an area which has a legacy of environmental impacts. It caused acid rain in the region quite significantly in history. Then you can see what you may recognize. You may never have seen those two things on the left before, but then many people might know what the Gigafactory looks like. Elon Musk is a very big name, and everyone knows Tesla. And on the right is the idealized vision of what an electric car and sustainability is. This is what, as a consumer, we might see, and we neglect to see the full history of where that car's come from. So, going back to my rock days, the raw materials that go into this technology really matter. So we've done a study recently looking at the difference of an impact of a modern battery, whether you get low impact materials versus high impact materials. And this might not mean much to you, but it can be double the impact just for the difference in raw material supply chains. Now, this matters when you start to think of how big this sector is and how fast it's evolving and how fast it's scaling. So the difference between sourcing these clean materials versus these high impact materials until the demand forecast to 2030, that's equivalent to the combined annual emissions from the Netherlands, Egypt and Argentina. So that puts into context the scale of it. These decisions that we're making now on how we design these supply chains really will have a tangible impact on whether we reach our carbon goals. So, we need to really take into consideration how we design these new supply chains. We need to make decisions as consumers, telling the companies, this is what's acceptable, this is not what's acceptable, and we need to have an understanding of this. And what you can do as a person, in the sector, the first point is demanding transparency on the environmental impacts of the products that you purchase. You're going to see this more and more over the next decade. You're going to see carbon intensities of your travel, carbon intensities of the products you purchase, and you should demand this. And if companies aren't providing that, they should be able to provide it. It should be a requirement for all of them. Educate yourselves about the way in which impact can be measured or calculated. I think this sort of understanding is going to be more and more important as we move through the next decades. And the last point really relates to this previous point, which is call out greenwashing. If you see a company making a claim without any evidence, call it out, ask for more evidence, ask for them to explain themselves, because at the end of the day, if we do nothing, they will make the easiest solution, which might be just making those claims. Thank you.